Hello and welcome to Pastoral Ministry. I'm Dr. Mewborn, and today we're looking at the topic working with a church staff. This is a great topic for us to look at, so let's begin our study. I want to start by talking about the idea of leadership potential, really unlocking your leadership potential. Kenneth Gainwell said, "Leadership potential is activated whenever a person's strengths overlap with the needs of a given situation." And so today we're going to talk about the idea of working with the staff, the needs of the church, and filling those needs with somebody who's very capable and fit to do it. And so we're going to talk about that today. In order to do that, we have to understand some differences between ministry positions. So we have ministerial roles, and then we have support staff roles, things like that. But let's talk first about ministerial roles. Those might include associate pastor, student minister, worship pastor, or children's minister. There are other types of ministers as well, like a missions minister. There may be somebody who is a women's minister. There's a lot of people out there that can serve in different roles. It just depends on the size of the church a lot of times. Some churches, or most churches, just have one ministerial staff person, and that is the pastor of the church. Maybe they also have the pastor, and then they have an associate pastor who does worship and students, possibly. But that's the way it's usually done. But depending on the size of the church, you could have a lot of people on a church staff, and so I wanted to add those in there just for a reference, just for our understanding of what we're talking about here. Now, support staff might include these types of folks: ministry assistants, church secretary, operations personnel, ministry interns, these types of folks. These are the ones who come alongside and they organize things, or they are helping support what ministers are doing. And depending on who you ask, some people would say they don't like the word support because it seems like it's taking away from what their calling is in ministry. But I do think it's helpful to understand the different roles. So a lot of times, if you are referring to a worship pastor, someone who is leading the music in a church, well, that person might have an assistant, might have an intern working with them. And I think that's a great way to say, hey, this person's come alongside and they're learning, they're being poured into. At the same time, they can fulfill a ministry duty, or they might be learning how to do something because they feel called to do something. And I think there's a couple of ways that the ministerial roles and positions and the support positions can really help create a strong church for the future, because you're always pouring into someone else. So in the idea of pastoral ministry, I think it's important that all ministers and pastors in general should be strengthening people around them so that they can take over certain tasks. Maybe they'll eventually take over for them one day. It just depends on how God is leading and what God's doing in that. So I'm a strong believer in strengthening, bringing people around you to do the ministry, always pouring into the next generation, always trying to work with people and create a team that can develop a wonderful program. You bring in people with different skill sets, and that can help your ministry go the next mile. It can help you really thrive and go to the next level. And I think that's a wonderful thing to look at. By the way, we should always be discipling people and pouring into other people anyways. And so whether it's the pastor pouring into his staff, pouring into the ministerial staff, the support staff, whatever, I think it's important that he's pouring into them and discipling them throughout his ministry. Now, before we go too far into what that looks like and how all these things play out, I want to talk about employment status, because there's many ways that people will serve on a church staff as a support staff or minister. They could be a volunteer, they could be part-time, they could be bivocational, they could be fully funded. This is a great way to look at that people serve on a church staff. And sometimes they're volunteers, sometimes they're getting paid for what they do. But however that looks, there's a certain way that you work with them. And in this lesson, we're going to focus more on paid staff and people that are in ministerial positions for that matter. And then the next one, we're going to focus more on volunteers and how we recruit and retain volunteers so that we can strengthen the church and that the church is mainly made up of lay leaders. I think that's when you really have when you know you have a strong church. All right, so we're going to look at those. But here's some basic principles for hiring personnel. So we're talking about working with a church staff or even hiring a church staff. Number one, establish a position. Consider the need and financial position of the church. Now, it's important for people who are looking to add someone onto a church staff that you look at what is the need. You don't just hire people because you want to hire people. You look at what is the need. Possibly you look at what is a person bringing, someone that's very qualified, has a lot of gifts, and they say, hey, I want to serve and I want to serve in this capacity. Well, is there a need there? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but maybe it's great that that person's serving alongside the pastor in whatever capacity that is. But usually you consider the need. What is that need? And then you try to see what the financial position of the church is. So can we handle hiring somebody for that position? And so when you do that, then you can start moving forward in the next steps. But establish a position, establish where you are, develop a job description, be specific and realistic with these responsibilities. So when you develop a job description for someone who's coming in, such as a children's minister or a youth minister or a college minister or men's minister, whatever, have a strong job description for them so that they know what they're to do. That's going to help them too with the expectations that are placed upon them. For instance, you might lay out a schedule for them. So on Mondays, you need to be doing this. On Tuesdays, you need to be doing this. On Wednesdays, you need to be doing this. Allowing some freedom there for them to create their own schedule somewhat, but also saying, hey, here's when we're meeting. Here's when we're doing visitation. Here's when we are having staff meetings. These are the things I need you at. So you got to be at these things. And around that, you can create your ministry. You can dream big. You can chase your goals. You can do whatever you want to. But these are the most important things as far as your schedule is concerned that you make sure you're at and you make sure you take care of. And so have a job description laid out. I think sometimes the scheduling helps too. Follow good hiring procedures. I think there's a lot of ways to do this, but working with a committee to find the right candidate is probably one of the best things you can do. That way, it has more. You have more people looking at the same candidate or looking at several candidates. When you've got more eyes on something, you're going to be able to see and have different perspectives for the person that you're looking at bringing on, and that is always very helpful when considering someone for a ministry position. So I think these are helpful for us. This is an old slide we've looked at in the past, but I think it's relevant for this class as well. 8 steps for pastor or minister search committees. And so when you think about hiring someone on for the church staff, I think you need to apply some of these steps, or I would say all these steps, but it just depends on how you do it. In some cases, if you're hiring a support staff, you may not have a committee for that. Then again, you might. Even hiring certain ministers, you may not have a search committee, but I think it's wise to have a search committee for people coming in. But here it is. Number 1, choose the committee. Number 2, survey the church. Number 3, write the job profile. 4, find strong candidates. Number 5, review resumes. Number 6, interview top candidates. Number 7, bring the candidate before the church. Number 8, help the new pastor or minister start well. Onboarding is a huge part of this. It's that we're going to go through the steps of finding the right person, interviewing the right person, hiring the right person, but then onboarding the right person is going to be a big part of working with that church staff member and doing it well. And so there are good and bad ways to do this, but it is so important to do it in the wisest way possible and getting a group of people involved in this process. I do not think the church should be involved in this process at the beginning. I think it should be a specific committee that is focused on these types of things. But I definitely think people need help because all of us have blind spots. All of us have things we don't see. We can think someone's great, but we're not seeing the bigger picture, and so it's good. And watching God work through a committee is always a wonderful thing as well. So 8 steps for a pastor minister search committee. I think that's great. 6 distinguishing marks of a call to gospel ministry, Stephen Lawson. So I want to put this out there. If we're looking at bringing on a staff member, or we have inherited a staff member, for instance, we've come into a position at a church as the pastor, and we are leading a group of other ministers. So they're under us, and so we're working with them. But let's say you've inherited them. And inheriting them, meaning that they were there before you got there. They were hired by the previous pastor. And so you come in, and here you are working on a staff with people that you didn't hire, so you don't fully know them. Well, one of the things that I would do is try to get to know them and try to find out their call to the gospel ministry. This would be one of the first things I do, is try to understand their call to the gospel ministry. This will be very telling. And so what does that look like? Well, Stephen Lawson talks about this. Inner compulsion, outside influence, loving concern for others, overwhelming constraint, can't do anything else, in other words, sobering humility, brokenness, corporate confirmation. Now, what are these distinguishing marks all about? It's to say that when you're talking to somebody, a staff member, or even personally, how do you know you're called to ministry? Well, these are ways that you can know. But the way that you can know that someone else is called to ministry, such as a student minister, such as a men's minister, well, you're going to have some of these distinguishing marks that will come out in their lives. But if you don't see this in them, then you may not either want to have them on your staff. You might want to kind of work with them and try to come alongside them and try to figure out what's going on. Or you might want to be careful about when hiring a staff member that you are thinking about these things. Do they have any of these experiences in their background? Is there an inner compulsion? Is there outside influence saying, man, you're called to ministry? Is this overwhelming constraint a part of their lives? Is there a brokenness about them? Whatever it is, these are wonderful, wonderful marks of a call to gospel ministry. Another thing that I think you need to look at when working with the church staff, and especially the ministerial roles, are people meeting the qualifications. So, for instance, if we're talking about elders, we're talking about deacons, however you want to put that, you got different standards of qualifications. But if you're looking at pastors and you're looking at a ministerial staff, you're going to have to look at these qualifications. And so we've looked at these in the past. I think they're helpful for us to look at again today. But what we're seeing here is that these qualifications are important for people that are on your staff. So if you have a staff member who is not exemplifying these things, or is messing up in one area, then you probably need to have a discussion with them, trying to find out what's going on in their lives, and in correcting that behavior, whatever that is. And so I think that's a vital aspect to working with a church staff, troubleshooting those areas, communicating well, making sure they understand the expectations. And if they're disqualifying themselves for ministry, well, what do? Well, you got to contact them. You got to connect with them. You got to show them where they're wrong. And in that, you can continue doing ministry well. If you go to them and you show them they're wrong, and they show remorse and they show repentance and they confess it, and they say, I want to get right. Maybe there's a process forward. Maybe there's a way to move forward with them and continue doing ministry. And it's going to strengthen the church. It's not going to harm the church. It's going to strengthen the church. I've seen it happen many, many times. So that's something important. Also, the idea of handling financial and personal issues. This is something that I think you always work with your staff. And this is a slide that we've also looked at in the past. Financial packages come in all shapes and sizes. So, where are people when it comes to salary, housing allowance, benefits, business expenses, vacation, conferences, and personal time? When working with a staff, it's important that you understand where they are financially. If you're in an area that it takes a certain amount of money to live by, and you have a pastor that's working on your staff, and the wife, maybe she stay at home, or maybe she has a small job on the side, whatever that might be, but it's really not enough to take care. What can you do if they're doing a great job? What can you do to get them where they need to be? Looking at a housing allowance the same way. Is there a parsonage? Are there benefits that they can receive from your church that they can't receive somewhere else? How can you take care of some of the costs that they're paying for, like a business expense, things like that? And then, is there personal time that they need? Do they need to have more time to work another job so that they can make ends meet because the church can't pay them enough? And so, is there time that they need? Is there vacation, conferences, personal time, all these other things? How are they being treated? So, if you want to work with someone well, you're probably going to have to include the topic of money if you're going to treat them well, because money is how people make it. Money is how people eat. Money is how people provide for their family. And so this is going to be a big part of working with the staff. So you have to consider those things. Now, basic principles for supervising coworkers, and this is probably more of the lengthier section here, but we'll be able to go through it pretty quickly. But how do you supervise coworkers? How do you supervise a staff? How do you do it well? Well, I think you have to have great training. You got to show people what they need to be doing on the church staff that meets the culture of that church staff and meets the standard of the church in general. So that's that. Orientation is the next thing. How do you create great orientation for folks to be acclimated or assimilated into the church and to start doing ministry quickly? I love the topic of getting small wins under your belt. Well, orientation can help you do that. Help them understand the culture of the church quickly. Help them get some good small wins under their belt, and that way that'll lead into some bigger wins later down the road. But orientation, letting them know what's what, who's who, and how we do certain things. Ongoing supervision. A big part of this is this ongoing onboarding process. For instance, if somebody is new or you're new, then there's going to be a form of supervision that people have to receive to understand where are we going from here? What's the next step? How am I being held accountable for what I'm doing? How are there measurables in a sense that I'm making sure I'm fulfilling what my job responsibilities are, and how do you do that? And so the church staff needs to be able to create that. Pastor needs to be able to create that for the church staff. Authority and delegation. You need to know who is in leadership in a certain area. So, the pastor is leading the church in general, but there may be people who are more of an expert in certain areas, and so the pastor, in some ways, will learn and listen from those folks so that they can work alongside them. But the authority in a situation is going to come mainly down the pastor. But how do you share authority with your staff? And you need to be able to do that and do it well. Delegation is a big part of this, and we'll talk about delegation in the next lesson as well. But authority and delegation are huge things that the pastor needs to be able to manage well. Communication, or communicating. One of the most important things a pastor can do is make sure people know his heart. Make sure people know his heart. And some of the good ways to do that is by creating prayer meetings or creating a time where the staff is getting together just to hear the pastor's heart. Maybe the church has opportunity where they have days every few weeks where the pastor just shares his heart from the pastor's heart. Maybe the pastor can go to different Sunday school classes or Bible fellowship classes and share his heart, but communicating what's going on and then communicating well across the organization, across the church is vital. Making sure that the communication coming from the pastor is clear, but also the communication going through the church and the church staff is clear, and then making sure the communication going up to the pastor is also extremely clear. So this is all important stuff. Next, reporting. Who reports to who, and what does that look like? How does the evaluation process work and all of that? And so, how can we let people know that they're doing the right thing? Correction and discipline is a part of supervising. It's not the easiest part, but it's definitely a part of it. Sometimes, if a staff member is doing something that is out of bounds, or it's not in sync with the staff, or it's showing a character or behavioral flaw that shouldn't be in the life of a minister or a staff person, a support staff, there may need to be some interaction there, some involvement where you call that out so that you can get people on the right track. And then rewarding. We've talked a lot about that, where when someone does something great, reward them. Minister to staff and their families. So whatever you can do to minister to a staff and their family, that's probably going to be key. All right, that concludes our lesson for today. This has been the topic, working with a church staff. It's good to be with you today. God bless you. Bye-bye.